At 90 years old, Leonard "Len" Carver still drew the same line whenever someone put a map of New Mexico in front of him. He began west of Albuquerque, moved his finger northeast, paused over empty country, then made an abrupt turn toward the mountains. "That's where it stopped behaving like an airplane," he said. Carver claimed that on an autumn night in 1957, while working as a young radar operator at a fictional Air Force surveillance site, he tracked an unidentified return moving across New Mexico at a speed and pattern he could not reconcile with the aircraft he knew. The contact lasted less than 20 minutes. By morning, the plotting sheet was gone. 2 nights later, according to Carver, 2 officers appeared at the small house he rented with his wife. They did not ask him what he believed he had seen. They asked what he had told her. This documentary is an original fictional reconstruction. Carver, the officers, the radar event, and the home visit are invented and are not presented as authentic historical testimony. But the setting reflects a real era in which radar, air defense, nuclear installations, classified aviation, and public anxiety about unidentified objects overlapped across the American Southwest. Carver's story asks, what happens when the mystery is not a light in the sky, but a mark on a screen seen by people trained to distrust marks that do not behave correctly? In 1957, radar work was less cinematic than later generations imagined. There were no glowing 3-dimensional maps or computerized voices identifying targets. Operators sat in dim rooms in front of circular scopes, watching luminous traces emerge from noise. They learned the personality of the equipment. Weather could clutter a display. Ground returns could create fixed patterns. Electronic interference could produce strange echoes. Birds, atmospheric conditions, equipment faults, and propagation effects all had to be considered before anyone used the word unknown. Len Carver's fictional training emphasized skepticism because a radar operator who treated every anomalous return as an intruder was almost as dangerous as one who ignored a real aircraft. He was 21, recently married, mechanically inclined, and proud of his ability to recognize routine traffic from a few sweeps of the antenna. His wife, Margaret, joked that he could describe aircraft he was forbidden to name, but could not remember what groceries she asked him to bring home. Carver had grown up in eastern Colorado, where distance was measured in straight roads and weather fronts. He joined the Air Force after high school and discovered that radar suited him. The work rewarded patience. A scope could appear empty for minutes, then suddenly demand complete attention. He learned to estimate heading, speed, and continuity from successive returns. He learned not to chase a single bright spot, because a single spot could be almost anything. A target became interesting only when it persisted. By late 1957, Carver had enough experience to distinguish ordinary uncertainty from the kind that made a supervisor walk closer to the console. He never claimed to be an engineer. He could operate and interpret the system assigned to him, perform routine checks, and recognize when the display did not match expectations. That limited competence is important. Carver's story depends not on him knowing everything about radar, but on knowing enough to understand when he needed another pair of eyes. The shift began quietly. The weather was clear over much of the region, and routine traffic had thinned. Carver remembered a clock reading shortly after 11, though decades later he could not guarantee the minute. Another operator was monitoring an adjacent sector. A controller sat several feet away. Carver noticed a return near the outer portion of his scope. It was weak on the first sweep, stronger on the second. Then absent, he marked nothing. On the next sweep, it returned farther east. He watched 3 more rotations before calling it to the controller. The contact appeared to be moving faster than the traffic he had been following, but speed estimates from a handful of plots could be misleading. The controller asked whether Carver had checked for known traffic. He had. The controller told him to continue tracking and call if the return persisted. It did. Carver placed a grease pencil mark on the transparent plotting surface and noted the time. The target advanced across successive sweeps with enough consistency to form a track. Then its behavior changed. Instead of continuing northeast, the return appeared nearly stationary for 2 sweeps. On the next, it was displaced south. Carver initially assumed he had lost one target and acquired another. He erased the projected line and began again. The controller came to the scope. Together, they watched the contact move west for several sweeps, then reverse. No conventional aircraft known to Carver could have made the transition in the distance implied by the plots. But that did not mean an aircraft had physically done so. Radar displays do not show objects directly. They show returned energy interpreted through equipment and operators. Carver understood that distinction even in 1957. His first suspicion was malfunction. The equipment checks did not reveal an obvious fault. Carver adjusted gain. The contact weakened with the rest of the display, then strengthened when the setting was restored. Fixed ground features remained where expected. Other known traffic continued to behave normally. The adjacent operator was asked whether he saw anything unusual. His coverage overlapped only part of the area, and for several minutes he saw nothing. Then, according to Carver, the second operator called out a return near the edge of his own scope at approximately the location Carver's track was approaching. That moment became central to Carver's memory, because it reduced one simple explanation. If 2 independent displays were responding to the same phenomenon, a fault isolated to his console became less likely. It did not eliminate propagation, interference, false targets, or other radar effects. It simply made the problem larger than one screen. The controller began making telephone calls. Carver could hear only his side of the conversations. He gave a sector, estimated heading, and approximate speed. He used the phrase unidentified track, not flying saucer. Carver insisted on that distinction for the rest of his life. The language inside an operations room was functional. Nobody needed a theory. They needed to know whether a target corresponded to authorized traffic, whether it presented a hazard, and whether another station could confirm it. A supervisor entered and stood behind Carver. The room became quieter. The target moved north, then appeared to slow again. Carver marked each position on a paper plot beside the console. He remembered his pencil breaking and having to sharpen it with a small metal sharpener while everyone waited for the next sweep. That ordinary irritation remained more vivid than any dramatic thought about extraterrestrials. A request went out for visual confirmation, though Carver never knew who received it. He later heard that an aircraft might have been directed toward the area, but he did not witness the decision and refused to make it part of his firm account. What he did see was the track. At one point it accelerated across several sweeps, covering a distance that produced an estimate the controller recalculated twice. Carver no longer trusted the number decades later and deliberately stopped repeating it, because sensational retellings tended to turn uncertain estimates into impossible speeds. It was fast enough that they checked my math, he said. That was all he would preserve. The target then made the movement that bothered him most. It approached the mountain region and seemed to vanish from one expected position, only to reappear several sweeps later on, a bearing that did not continue the previous path. The supervisor asked whether terrain masking could account for the disappearance. Carver said perhaps. Radar coverage around mountains can create complicated blind zones and anomalous behavior. But the reappearance did not sit where Carver expected a simple terrain gap to place it. The contact seemed to have changed direction while absent. Again, the word seemed mattered. A radar track is a chain of observations joined by interpretation. If one link disappears, the operator decides whether the next return belongs to the same target. Carver and the controller decided that it probably did because of timing and location. They could have been wrong. This became one of the reasons the elderly Carver disliked documentaries that animated his imagined track as a continuous glowing line. "We never saw a line," he said. "We saw dots and decided which dots belonged together." Shortly before the contact ended, another telephone rang. The supervisor answered, listened, and told everyone in the room to stop discussing the track except through official channels. Carver remembered the instruction because no one had been discussing it casually in the first place. The target made 2 final appearances, then disappeared. Operators watched several additional sweeps. Nothing returned. The controller asked Carver to complete the plot, while the positions were fresh. He transferred times and approximate bearings to a sheet and initialed it. The second operator added a notation regarding his brief contact. The supervisor collected the page. Carver expected it to be attached to the shift record. He also expected questions. Instead, the room returned to routine traffic with an artificial calm. The most unusual track of Carver's young career had ended without explanation and without anyone saying what they thought it had been. At the end of the shift, Carver asked the controller whether he should write a separate incident statement. The controller told him to wait. A captain arrived before Carver left the facility. He questioned Carver for perhaps 15 minutes in a small office. The questions were technical: first detection, number of sweeps, settings, whether known traffic was present, whether the target faded with gain adjustments, whether he had experienced equipment trouble earlier in the shift. Carver answered. The captain did not ask whether he had seen anything visually. Carver had not. He did not ask whether Carver believed the target came from space. He asked who else had been at the consoles and whether Carver had discussed the event outside the room. Carver said no. The captain told him that was appropriate and dismissed him. Carver drove home after sunrise. Margaret was awake because their infant daughter had been restless. She asked why he was late. Carver said there had been an unusual track. Margaret had heard enough vague stories from his work to know not to ask for classified details. She poured coffee and asked whether it had been dangerous. Carver said he did not know. Then, despite the instruction to keep the event within official channels, he drew the track on the back of a grocery receipt. He did not write coordinates or facility information. He simply sketched the motion as he remembered it. Northeast, pause, reversal, north, disappearance, reappearance. Margaret looked at the line and said it resembled someone changing his mind. Carver folded the receipt and put it in his wallet. He later claimed he forgot it was there. The next shift was stranger because nothing was said. Carver checked the log area and did not see the plotting sheet. He asked the controller whether the track had been identified. The controller answered, "It's being handled." The second operator avoided the subject. Carver interpreted that as pressure at the time, though it could equally have been caution. A technical officer inspected part of the radar system. Carver asked whether there had been a fault. The officer said routine maintenance. For the rest of the shift, Carver watched the scope with unusual intensity and saw nothing he could not explain. The equipment behaved normally. That normality bothered him. A persistent malfunction would have been comforting because it would have given the previous night a mechanical cause. 2 evenings later, Margaret answered a knock at the door. 2 men stood on the porch. Both wore Air Force uniforms beneath dark overcoats. One was a major, or so Carver remembered from the insignia. The other was younger and spoke little. They asked for Airman Carver. Len came from the kitchen, expecting news about work. The major showed identification too quickly for him to read, and asked whether they could come inside. Carver said yes. The visit lasted less than half an hour. No one raised his voice. No threat was made. Yet when Carver described the event 60 years later, this quiet conversation frightened him more than the radar track. An unknown return belonged at work. 2 officers standing beside his daughter's crib did not. The major began with a question Carver expected. Had he discussed the radar incident with anyone outside authorized personnel? Carver said no. The major asked again, more specifically, whether he had described the track to his wife. Carver hesitated. Margaret was in the room. He admitted he had told her there was an unusual target, but claimed he had not shared operational details. The major turned to Margaret and asked what her husband had told her. She answered that he said something odd appeared on radar. The officer asked whether Len had drawn anything. Carver felt his stomach tighten. He had not told anyone about the grocery receipt. Margaret looked at him before answering. That glance was enough. The major asked, "Where is the drawing?" Carver retrieved his wallet. The receipt was still folded behind his driver's license. He handed it over. The major opened it on the dining table. According to Carver, the officer studied the crude line for longer than seemed necessary. He asked whether the drawing represented actual plotted positions or only Carver's memory. Carver said memory. He asked whether the direction was accurate. Carver said approximately. Then the major asked something that changed the tone of the visit. Did you mark the second return? Carver did not understand. The Major tapped the portion after the gap near the mountains. This one, he said. Carver answered that he had drawn the reappearance because he believed it was the same track. The officer asked why. Carver explained timing, bearing, and the controller's judgment. The Major folded the receipt and placed it inside his notebook. Carver asked whether he could have the receipt back. The Major said it contained information related to an operational matter and would be retained. Margaret objected that it was only a grocery receipt. The younger officer almost smiled, then looked down. The Major remained polite. He told Carver not to make additional drawings, not to discuss the event, and not to contact civilian organizations about unidentified aerial phenomena. That last instruction surprised Carver because he had never mentioned UFO groups and had no interest in contacting one. The Major said public speculation could compromise air defense procedures. In the context of the Cold War, that explanation was not absurd. Radar coverage, detection capability, response times, and blind zones were sensitive information. A detailed public account could reveal more than the identity of one unknown target. Carver understood that intellectually. What he did not understand was how the officers knew about a drawing made privately in his kitchen. After the men left, Margaret locked the door. She asked whether Len had mentioned the receipt at work. He had not. Had anyone seen it? He did not think so. Had he left his wallet unattended? Of course. Lockers, uniforms, desks, there were countless opportunities. Margaret offered a simpler possibility. Perhaps the officers were asking every operator whether they had made notes or drawings, and Carver's hesitation had revealed the answer. Over the years, Carver came to favor her explanation because it required no surveillance, no hidden microphones, and no elaborate conspiracy. They were better at questioning a 21-year-old than I was at lying, he said. The mystery of the home visit became less about how they knew, and more about why a rough memory sketch mattered enough to confiscate. Carver also remembered one detail about procedure that seemed insignificant, until his daughter asked him to reconstruct the shift minute by minute. During routine tracking, operators often developed a rhythm. Observe, compare, mark, wait for the next sweep. The unidentified return broke that rhythm because each new position changed the meaning of the previous one. A slow contact could become fast when the next plot appeared farther away. A turn could become two separate targets if continuity failed. A disappearance could be terrain, fading signal, equipment, or simply the end of the event. Carver said the room did not erupt into excitement. Instead, voices became shorter. People stopped explaining themselves because everyone was watching the same clock. That restraint was important to him. Later UFO retellings often imagined alarms, scrambling jets, and officers shouting orders. His memory contained none of that. The tension came from professionals trying not to make a mistake while knowing that each sweep might remove or strengthen an explanation. When the contact vanished for good, nobody celebrated. The supervisor simply asked for the plot. Carver would later think that this was how genuine uncertainty looked inside a technical workplace, not astonishment, but paperwork becoming suddenly important. For the next several weeks, Carver heard nothing official. He was not punished. He remained on duty. No security clearance was dramatically revoked. The absence of consequences made the event difficult to categorize. If he had violated a serious order, why was there no disciplinary action? If the track was unimportant, why had officers visited his home? Carver began to suspect that the concern was not the object itself, but the information environment around it. Radar systems were part of a larger defense network. Unknown tracks could reveal limitations, false return patterns, coverage gaps, or response procedures. A sketch drawn from memory might accidentally map those vulnerabilities. This conventional explanation satisfied him for years. He told Margaret they had probably encountered an electronic anomaly wrapped in a security problem. She accepted that answer more easily than he did. Carver served several more years and then left the Air Force. He worked in telecommunications, raised 3 children, and rarely discussed the 1957 incident. When UFO programs appeared on television, his family teased him because he watched the radar scenes critically. He complained when screens behaved impossibly or operators announced exact speeds from a single sweep. He never told his children that one reason the mistakes annoyed him was personal. Margaret kept the story private. Once, during the 1970s, a magazine published an article about New Mexico sightings, and she asked whether he wanted to write to the author. Carver said no. He had no document, no plot, no receipt, no photograph, and no visual observation. "I'd be a man saying a dot moved funny," he told her. That sentence became his defense against the temptation to turn uncertainty into a larger claim. What Carver did preserve was technical humility. He read about anomalous propagation, temperature inversions, radar angels, electronic countermeasures, false targets, and the many ways early systems could mislead operators. Some explanations seemed capable of producing portions of what he remembered. None perfectly reproduced the whole sequence in his mind, but memory was not a preserved instrument recording. It had been rebuilt across decades. Carver openly admitted that later knowledge could have altered his interpretation. He could not provide the exact radar frequency, antenna characteristics, range settings, weather profile, or maintenance status needed for serious retrospective analysis. Without those, no radar expert could responsibly identify the cause. The event remained an anecdote, even if a technically informed one. The story changed after Margaret died. While sorting papers, Carver's eldest daughter found a small spiral notebook among her mother's recipes. Most pages contained household expenses. One page was dated only Thursday and contained a short description. "Len late after strange radar. Drew path on Safeway slip. 2 AF men came Saturday. Took drawing. Asked about second spot after mountain. The note was not proof. It had no year and no independent authentication, but within the fictional family narrative, it mattered because Carver had not remembered Margaret writing it. More importantly, her wording preserved the phrase, second spot after mountain, a detail Carver associated with the Major's question. His daughter asked what it meant. For the first time, Carver told his children the complete story. They wanted to know why the reappearance mattered. Carver explained with coins on the kitchen table. One coin represented the target before it disappeared near the mountains. Another represented the later return. Connecting them into one track required an assumption. If they were separate phenomena, the strange apparent maneuver largely disappeared. If they were the same target, then something had crossed or circumvented a region where the radar did not show a continuous path and emerged on an unexpected bearing. The Major's question suggested that investigators were focused on that same interpretive link. Perhaps they had information from another station. Perhaps they had a visual report. Perhaps they were trying to determine whether operators had mistakenly joined two unrelated contacts. Carver did not know, but he realized that the officers had not come to ask about the dramatic speed estimate. They had come interested in the gap. There was another reason the home visit stayed vivid. The Major knew Carver's wife by name. This was not inherently mysterious. Personnel records contained family information, and an officer visiting an enlisted man could easily have reviewed it. At 21, however, Len experienced the knowledge differently. Margaret had been part of his private life, not his radar shift. When the Major said, "Mrs. Carver, we need to know exactly what your husband described," Len felt the institution expand into the room. Margaret remained composed. She said Len had drawn a crooked line and complained that something on his screen had changed direction. The Major asked whether he had mentioned altitude. She said no. Speed? No. A location? Only New Mexico, which hardly narrowed anything. The officer seemed relieved by those answers. That reaction later supported Carver's conventional interpretation. Perhaps the visit was primarily about preventing disclosure of capabilities and locations. But then came the question about the second return, and the conversation narrowed again to the anomaly itself. That mixture security questions surrounding one very specific, technical detail was why Carver never found a single explanation completely satisfying. That insight became the strongest revelation of Carver's fictional testimony. For decades, he assumed secrecy surrounded the target because it had moved unusually fast. Yet the home visit, as preserved in Margaret's note, centered on the return after the mountains. Why? One possibility was purely technical. Investigators may have been studying radar coverage and wanted to know how operators interpreted contacts near terrain. Another possibility was operational. A classified aircraft or test system might have entered a protected corridor, disappeared from one radar geometry, and appeared in another. A third possibility was that separate sensors had detected something during Carver's gap, making his reappearance significant in a way he could not know. None requires extraterrestrial technology. Each, however, explains why a crude drawing could matter to people with access to a larger picture. Carver's daughter asked whether he believed the Air Force knew what the target was. His answer resembled the logic of many old mysteries. I think somebody knew more than I did. That doesn't mean they knew what it was. Institutions contain layers. A radar operator sees one screen. A controller sees traffic coordination. A regional command may receive reports from multiple stations. Intelligence personnel may know about classified tests. No individual necessarily possesses the complete answer. Secrecy can therefore look like certainty from below, even when it protects uncertainty above. Carver came to believe the officers' behavior might have reflected concern rather than knowledge. They were collecting fragments because they did not yet understand the event. If so, his grocery receipt drawing was not dangerous because it revealed a secret craft. It was useful because it preserved a witness's memory of a track they were still trying to reconstruct. This interpretation also explains why Carver resisted the familiar phrase, "the Air Force covered it up." Cover up implies a known truth deliberately hidden. What he described was narrower. Records were removed from his reach. He was told not to discuss an operational event, and officers collected a private sketch. In a Cold War air defense context, those actions could occur around classified procedures, even if the unknown target had an ordinary explanation. Carver never saw a spacecraft. He never saw occupants. He never handled exotic material. He watched radar returns. The restraint does not solve the story, but it protects it from becoming something the evidence cannot support. If a viewer wants an alien craft, Carver offers no proof. If a skeptic wants a confirmed equipment fault, he offers no proof of that either. Near the end of his life, Carver agreed to sit for one recorded interview. His daughter placed Margaret's notebook on the table beside him. He would not call it evidence. "It's evidence that she remembered me being upset," he said. He described the operations room again, concentrating on sensory details: dim amber lamps, cigarette smoke from the controller's desk, the soft mechanical sounds of equipment, grease pencil on transparent plastic, the repeated sweep that made waiting feel longer than it was. When asked what frightened him during the track, he said nothing. He had been too busy. Fear came at home when the major asked for the drawing. Work had procedures. Home was supposed to be outside the event. The officers crossing that boundary transformed an unusual technical problem into a memory that followed his family for decades. His daughter then asked what he would want back if he could recover one missing item: the official plot or the grocery receipt. Carver chose the official plot immediately. The receipt was memory rendered as a line after the fact. The plot had times and positions recorded during the event. With that sheet, modern analysts might compare the track against known radar effects, historical weather, military activity, and geography. Without it, every reconstruction begins with an old man's recollection. Carver understood the weakness. "The thing I want most," he said, "is the thing I can't show you ever existed." That sentence captures the central frustration of secrecy narratives. Missing evidence can explain why a case cannot be verified, but the absence of evidence cannot itself prove what the missing material contained. The interview ended with the map. Carver traced the path one last time. Northeast, pause, reverse, north, gap, reappearance. He stopped his finger at the mountains. His daughter asked whether he thought the object had gone behind them. Carver corrected her. "The return disappeared near them," he said. She asked whether he thought it was one object throughout the track. He paused longer. That's what we decided that night. Then she asked whether he still believed it. Carver looked at Margaret's notebook. I believe we had a reason to decide it, he said. I don't remember enough to tell you whether the reason was good. For a witness-centered mystery, there may be no more credible ending than that. Not certainty recovered with age, but certainty surrendered. The most unsettling possibility in Carver's story is therefore not that radar proved an extraterrestrial craft crossed New Mexico in 1957. It did not. This is fiction, and even within the fiction the technical record is missing. The unsettling possibility is that everyone involved possessed only a fragment. Carver had the screen. The adjacent operator had a brief confirmation. The controller had the track. A supervisor had telephone reports. The visiting officers may have had information from somewhere else. Margaret had the memory sketch. Then those fragments separated. The official plot vanished into a system Carver could not access. The receipt went into a major's notebook. Margaret's household note survived by accident. Decades later, the witness was left with a route drawn from memory and a question nobody had answered for him. In his final telling, Carver said the event taught him to respect records more than recollections. A radar plot made during the shift could be challenged, measured, and compared. His memory could only be questioned. That was not an insult. It was the normal condition of being human. He wanted anyone hearing the story to begin there. If such an event had happened, the answer might have been disappointingly terrestrial, unusual propagation, a classified test, electronic interference, two contacts mistakenly joined into one track, or some combination of ordinary factors made extraordinary by incomplete information. It might also have remained genuinely unidentified. Unidentified is not a synonym for extraterrestrial. It is an admission that available information did not produce a confident identification. Carver understood that better at 90 than he did at 21. He no longer cared whether people called the track a UFO. He cared about whether they understood what the word unknown meant. Unknown was not a conclusion. It was the space left when the evidence stopped. And that is where this fictional account remains. There is no authenticated radar plot, no verified Air Force memorandum, no surviving grocery receipt, and no historical record establishing Leonard Carver's encounter. What remains inside the story is an elderly operator's disciplined distinction between what appeared on a screen and what he imagined might have caused it. He never saw a craft over New Mexico. He saw returns that people in the room treated seriously, and later he saw two officers standing inside his home, asking about the part of the track he understood least. If their purpose was simply to protect classified radar procedures, their behavior makes sense. If they were investigating an unknown object, their questions make sense too. But one detail survives as the unresolved center. They were not most interested in how fast the target seemed to move. They wanted to know why Carver believed the return after the mountain gap was the same thing he had been tracking before it disappeared. Perhaps somewhere, on another screen or in another report, someone had seen what happened during those missing sweeps. Or perhaps the officers were asking because nobody had.